Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed. Today, we're taking a look at Intel's new Arc A580, the newest member of the Arc A series, based on the Alchemist GPU architecture. Essentially, what you're getting here is all the same modern features that you get with the A750, such as AV1 encoding, XeSS support, and ray tracing, but at a more affordable price point. So, that's a bit exciting. But before we get into it,
today's video is sponsored by ASUS and their fantastic ROG Strix XG27 AQMR gaming monitor. If you're after a 27-inch 1440p display with super fast 300Hz capabilities, look no further than the XG27 AQMR. Packing variable overdrive and excellent response time tuning, this IPS LCD monitor offers great motion clarity for everything from fast-paced multiplayer games to the latest AAA blockbusters. In our review, we also found it to be quite a versatile display, with impressive color accuracy and a decent range of color controls, all at a mid-range price point. To learn more about the ASUS XG27 AQMR, click the link in the description below.
Okay, so while the A580 is going to be more affordable than the A750, it's also going to be slower, but hopefully not too much slower. And without question, it's going to be much faster than the horribly slow A380 that we looked at a year ago now, as it's much closer to the A750 in terms of specs, given that it does share the same silicon, along with the A770. So in short, the A580 packs 3,072 shader units, 192 TMUs and 96 ROPs, so that's 14% fewer shader units and ROPs when compared to the A750, but the same number of TMUs. And as a side note, there's 3 times more shader units, TMUs, and ROPs than the A380. Another downgrade though, when compared to the A750, includes a 33% reduction in L2 cache capacity with just 8 megabytes, but other than that, they are very similar. In fact, the A580, A750, and 8GB A770 all feature the same memory configuration down to the last detail. That means the A580 comes with 8GB of GDDR6 memory operating at 16GB per second on a 256-bit wide memory bus for a bandwidth of 512GB per second. The A580 also supports the full x16 PCIe 4.0 interface and features a TDP of 175 watts. So in terms of performance, it shouldn't be that much slower than the A750, which is a good thing given that Intel has set the MSRP at $180 US. Just $40 US less than what you can currently purchase the A750 for, so it works out to be an almost 20% discount. Now the focus for this comparison though won't be with the A750, rather the more relevant competition in the Radeon RX 6600 and I guess the GeForce RTX 3050. The RX 6600 is particularly relevant given that it can be had for $210 US right now, whereas the most affordable RTX GPU, so the RTX 3050, that generally costs quite a bit more, though I am seeing quite a lot of models dropping down around $230 US at the moment. That said, we know that the RTX 3050 is generally slower than the RX 6600, so even at $230 US, it's not going to be a great deal. Anyway, as it stands, the A580's key competitors here are the RX 6600 and RTX 3050, so let's see how they compare. Now, normally for a review, I would include more than a dozen GPUs for comparison, but for this one, I didn't have that much time to work with, so I decided to test a range of newer games comparing the A580, 6600, and 3050. And that means all of the data for this content is 100% fresh. And of course, for testing, we are using our AMD Ryzen 7 7800X 3D test system with 32GB of DDR5 6000 CL30 memory. The latest display drivers were used for all 3 GPUs, and resizable bar was enabled, as that's the default setting for this hardware configuration. In total, we have a dozen games to go over, tested at both 1080p and 1440p, along with some overclocking and power consumption figures as well, so let's get into it. First up, we have The Last of Us Part 1, and this isn't a particularly favourable showing for the Arc GPUs. And this is true in particular for the A580, as it managed just 41 FPS at 1080p and 19 FPS at 1440p using the high preset, and Intel does claim that this is a high quality 1080p gaming GPU. But in this comparison, the RTX 3050 was 20% faster at 1080p, while the RX 6600 was a massive 44% faster, so that's pretty bad for Intel. I should note though that Intel says they have addressed the poor ARC performance in The Last of Us Part 1 with their October 4th driver release, though sadly for whatever reason those fixes didn't make it into the A580's release driver. Bit of an oversight there, but they claim the next A580 driver will include those fixes. Next we have the very popular Baldur's Gate 3, and here the A580 is much more competitive, though it did suffer a few minor frame pacing issues when compared to the RX 6600. Generally speaking though, performance overall was similar between these two GPUs, allowing the A580 to beat the RTX 3050 by a rather substantial 29% margin. The A580 was also competitive in Resident Evil 4, beating the RTX 3050 by a 17% margin at 1080p, while coming in just 10% slower than the RX 6600. So not a bad result overall, and 75 FPS at 1080p, using the prioritized graphic quality preset, is a good result I'd say. Moving on to the Calisto Protocol, we find more highly competitive results from the A580. Here it is able to match the RX 6600 at both tested resolutions, making it 22% faster than the RTX 3050, so again, this is a great result for Intel. Now another rather awful title for ARC is Starfield, and here things are really bad, and this one does highlight a problem with the Intel ARC GPUs. That said, while performance for the A580 is just awful here, Intel's again claiming that performance here has been addressed with the latest driver, but again, those fixes just weren't included in the A580 release driver, which again is just a massive oversight in my opinion. In any case, we've seen a lot of these issues with the ARC GPUs, and while performance can be excellent like what we saw in the previous two titles, it can also tank to the point of being completely unusable, and that's certainly the case here. The RX 6600 was good for 47 FPS at 1080p using the medium quality preset, while the A580 could only muster 16 FPS. So there's really not much more that needs to be said about that isn't already obvious. Interestingly, Ratchet and Clank Rift Apart is a super title for the A580. Here it straight up murdered the RX 6600 and RTX 3050, delivering 32% more frames at 1080p and 45% more at 1440p. In fact, these results were so good, I had to go back and check all three GPUs, but the results were right. And I think it's fair to say that based on the die size and power usage, which we will look at in a moment, I can't help but feel we should be seeing more of this from the ARC GPUs like the A580. Here we see that Intel's new $180 US GPU is impressive relative to the Radeon and GeForce competition in Star Wars Jedi Survivor, smashing the RTX 3050 by a 23% margin at 1080p to deliver RX 6600-like performance, so a great result here. Hitman 3 is another strong title for the A580. Here it again matched the RX 6600 at 1080p and even beat it by a 10% margin at 1440p with an impressive and very playable 75 FPS on average. The F123 performance was a little underwhelming, but even so, the A580's performance overall was good, with 121 FPS at 1080p and 95 FPS at 1440p, which placed it roughly on par with the RTX 3050, particularly at the higher 1440p resolution. It was also 20% slower than the RX 6600 at 1080p, but as I said, performance overall was still good. The Forza Horizon 5 results are solid. The A580 was closer to the RX 6600 than it was the RTX 3050 at 1080p, with 88 FPS on average. That made it 15% slower than the RX 6600, but 24% faster than the RTX 3050. Then at 1440p, it was 31% faster than the RTX 3050, and the additional memory bandwidth allowed it to match the RX 6600. The A580 was very impressive when testing with Cyberpunk 2077 Phantom Liberty. Here it edged out the RX 6600 at 1080p and beat it by a 19% margin at 1440p. That also made it 31% faster than the RTX 3050 at 1080p and a massive 42% faster at 1440p. And last up, we have Spider-Man Remastered, and again, the A580 is very impressive here, beating the RX 6600 by a 4% margin at 1080p and 11% at 1440p. Therefore, as you'd expect based on that, it easily beat the RTX 3050. Okay, so here's a look at the 12-game average, which includes the very poor performance seen in The Last of Us Part 1 and Starfield, which Intel claims will be addressed with the next driver update for the A580. To what degree, though, we will have to wait for that upcoming driver to find out. So based on that data though, the A580 was 12% slower than the RX 6600, which isn't too bad given that it should be around 14% cheaper, but we'll talk more about that soon. The good news is it was 10% faster than the RTX 3050, which I guess is good news for Intel, though it more highlights just how trash tier the RTX 3050 is and always has been, so I guess there's that. Then, at 1440p, the A580 was 9% slower than the RX 6600 and at 12% faster than the RTX 3050. So that's pretty good, but with Intel claiming to be addressing the performance seen in The Last of Us Part 1 and Starfield, you could say that this data misrepresents the A580, despite the fact that it doesn't, and as things stand, the data is accurate. We've also seen more examples in the past where ARC GPUs struggle more than they probably should, but for argument's sake, let's say that including the data is unfair, so let's remove it. Here's the 10-game average with The Last of Us Part 1 and Starfield removed. Now, the A580 and RX 6600 are neck and neck at 1080p, making the A580 a massive 22% faster than the RTX 3050, so that's a write-off for Nvidia. Then at 1440p, Intel's new Arc GPU is 7% faster than the RX 6600 and 30% faster than the RTX 3050, so a great set of results there for the A580. Okay, time for some RT benchmarks, and here we see when enabling ray tracing in Resident Evil 4 with the ray tracing preset, that the A580 was good for 66 FPS on average at 1080p, making it 6% faster than the RX 6600 and 18% faster than the RTX 3050, so a great result there. For benchmarking with Cyberpunk 2077 Phantom Liberty, I used the medium ray tracing preset, and that was a bit much for these GPUs, even when factoring in the possibility of using upscaling. The A580 does well relative to the competition, just beating the RTX 3050, but overall performance was horrible. Then the last game I looked at with ray tracing enabled is Spider-Man Remastered, and here all three GPUs do very well. The A580 was comparable to both the RTX 3050 and RX 6600, so a good result overall. Unfortunately though, a big weakness of the A580 is power consumption, and there are a few issues here. Firstly, when compared to the Radeon and GeForce competition, you're looking at a 35% increase in power usage for our test system when using the A580, and that's a massive increase. We're talking around 80 watts more for often less performance, so that's pretty bad. But possibly worse than that was the at least 50% increase in idle power draw, jumping up from around 80 to 90 watts with the RX 6600 and RTX 3050 to almost 130 watts with the A580. So that's a problem, and I'm not sure if Intel can address it with a future driver update, but hopefully they can. Now just quickly, here's a look at the overclocking performance of our sample. Stock it was typically observed operating at 2.4 GHz, and I was able to raise that to 2.6 GHz without compromising stability. Again, this is just a sample size of 1, so the typical overclocking potential of the A580 is unknown at this point in time. Anyway, with our overclock, testing with Cyberpunk, it only showed an increase of a few frames, suggesting that core clock speed wasn't the primary performance limiting factor here. But if we look at Hitman 3, we see a much more impressive 11 to 12% increase depending on the resolution, so that's pretty decent. Of course, you can also overclock the RX 6600 and RTX 3050 to varying degrees depending on the silicon quality, so this isn't a big win for the A580. Then we're looking at a more mild 6 to 10% uplift depending on the resolution with Spider-Man Remastered, so about what you'd typically expect to see from this sort of mild overclock. And just lastly, as I mentioned earlier, due to the time crunch, I couldn't add loads of GPUs to this content, but I did throw in the RX 7600, RTX 4060 and A750 for a few quick tests, just so you have some kind of reference point to those products. At 1080p and F123, the A580 was 14% slower than the A750, 30% slower than the RTX 4060 and 37% slower than the RX 7600. Right now, you can reliably purchase an RX 7600 for $250 US, making the A580 about 28% cheaper. So in this one example, the Radeon A3 based 7600 is much better value, especially if you want a game at 1440p. However, the A580 was more competitive in Hitman 3, and here it's just 9% slower than the A750 at 1080p and 12% slower at 1440p, so that's good because at $180 US it will be almost 20% cheaper than the current A750 pricing. Then when compared to the RX 7600, it was 20% slower at 1080p and 26% slower than the RTX 4060. So in this example, it's decent value next to those newer AMD and Nvidia models. So there you have it, Intel's newest Arc GPU, the A580. At $180 US, I'd say it's not bad. It's certainly not amazing, but it's not bad, and as far as GPU reviews go this year, it's actually pretty good. I guess the first question though the first question you might have is, should you actually buy it? And the answer to that is kind of a long-winded, it depends, with most paths unfortunately leading us to conclude that, you probably shouldn't buy it. The problems with the A580 are as follows. It requires resizable bar to work correctly, and proper resizable bar support can be an issue for older systems, the kind of systems that are probably in need of a new sub $200 US graphics card. But if you can address the need for resizable bar support, another issue might be power consumption. Compared to the Radeon RX 6600, for example, the A580 was generally slower while consuming significantly more power, so that might be a problem for you. There's also the issue of performance, and while quite good for the most part, we've often found that Arc GPUs can be a bit inconsistent. To be fair to Intel though, they have been demonstrating a strong commitment to making Arc better over the past year, and appear to be working as hard as ever to make the project work. So while I'm confident they will continue to improve here, generally speaking at this point in time, it's a safer bet to go with a Radeon or GeForce GPU, at least in my opinion. And keeping all of that in mind, I'm not sure the A580 is going to be cheap enough at $180 US, given that RX 6600s are sitting at $210 US right now. And while that does mean that the Arc GPU offers a nice 14% discount for what is often similar performance when things are working as expected, I think you'd want at minimum that kind of discount given the drawbacks just mentioned. For example, I often say that Radeon GPUs need to be at least 15% cheaper than their GeForce competitors, as they often consume more power, are much weaker for ray tracing, and FSR at this point in time is an inferior upscaling and frame generation technology to that of DLSS. But AMD's Radeon display drivers have been excellent for us, with the RDNA 2 and 3 generations, arguably better than Nvidia's, as we've had far fewer issues with multi-monitor setups as one example. In short though, if I were given the option of owning and gaming with either the A580 at $180 or the RX 6600 at $210, I'd go with the Radeon GPU every time. And in fact, I'd probably check out the RX 7600, as some models have dropped as low as $240 US now, and that's a pretty great price for that product. And it's also a more usable product in my opinion, despite the 8GB VRAM limitation. The Arc A580 is certainly a decent offering. At $180 US, I think it's fair to say it's far from bad, but also I'm just not sure that I'm ready to roll the dice at Intel just yet. As I said, they have come a long way in a relatively short period of time, so good work Intel, but there is also more work to be done before I'd part with my money. And that is where I'm going to leave this one. If you enjoyed the video, give it a thumbs up, subscribe for more content, and if you'd like some more Hardware Unboxed goodness, then check us out over at Floatplane or Patreon. Sign up to either one of those things, you will get access to our exclusive Discord server, so for members only, pretty cool place to hang out, talk tech and other stuff. We also do a monthly live stream, Tim and myself get together and do that, behind the scenes content, Q&A stuff, a lot of cool things there, worth checking out if you're interested, I suppose. But if not, that is perfectly fine, and I would like to thank you for watching this video. I'm your host, Steve. See you again next time.